It happens. If you have, thank you. If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to John chapter 1. I've used John 1 in an Easter message once, which is not a typical use, and it's really not a typical use to use John 1 as a Christmas platform for a sermon either. And the reason is, John's gospel is very, very different from the other gospels, from what we call the synoptics, that is, the summaries of Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The synoptics read like ancient biography. That's how they read. Now, John's does as well, but what John's gospel does is he opens windows into arenas of the supernatural that there's no way we would have any knowledge of whatsoever if John didn't do this. I mean, it's a really amazing thing. And I want to focus on one aspect of John's introduction here to his gospel, and that's the word grace. And I want to do it by telling you a little story. This is something that you all may or may not know. I bet Nancy knows this because her dad was a pastor. But pastors have what are called pastor's books. And they're full of all kinds of little stories and little jokes that you can tell, pastor jokes, you know, that everybody, sometimes are funny, sometimes they're not. Little stories that you can weave in and out and use them in sermons. Well, this is a pastor's story, so I didn't make this up. So I'm passing it along to get us started thinking about grace as we look at John's gospel. There was a man. We're starting the pastor's story now, just to alert you to that fact. There was a man who came to heaven. He died, and then he woke up, and there he is standing at the gate. And it so happened that Gabriel was assigned gate duty. And so the man comes up to Gabriel, and Gabriel says, "What are you doing here?" The man says, "Well, I guess I'm ready to come to heaven." Gabriel says, "Well, why should we let you in?" The man, a little nervous, as you would think somebody might be, tad nervous if you get asked a question like that and you've already died. I mean, and so Gabriel says, "Well, I'll tell you what." The man says, "Well, what about the good things that I've done?" And Gabriel says, "That sounds good. Let's start there." So the man says, "Okay, what do I have to do to get in?" Gabriel says, "It's easy." He said, "All you've got to do is accumulate 100 points to get in. You're in." The man says, "Oh, okay." He said, "Well, 100 points for what?" Gabriel says, "The good things that you've done in your life." "Oh, okay." So the man says, "Well, I stayed married to the same woman for 54 years. I never cheated on her. I took care of her. I was faithful throughout that entire time." And Gabriel says, "Wow, awesome. 3 points." The guy says, "Wow, okay, well." He says, "Well, I have faithfully supported my church. I attended every Sunday. I was there. I gave money. I helped with the Sunday school. If there was a church work day, I participated there." The man says, Gabriel says, "Man, that's really good. 1 point." So the man, I mean, he's at 4 points now, and he's getting a little nervous because he's really, I mean, there's not much life left here for him, right? He's described most of what his life was composed of, his whole marriage and his whole life in the church. So he says, "Well, I did start a homeless shelter in my hometown." And Gabriel says, "That's amazing. 2 points." So now the man is really nervous. He's accumulated 6 points. He's 94 points short. And he realizes there's not much left of his life to even talk about. What are you going to talk about? And the man just looks at Gabriel and hangs his head and says, "Well, I guess the only way I'm going to get in is by God's grace." And Gabriel just swings the gate open and lets him in. It's a pastor story, but keep it in mind if you would. Let's take a look at the text. John 1, verse 1. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was with God in the beginning. All things were created by Him, and apart from Him, not one thing that was created has been created. In Him was life, and the life was the light of humanity." And the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not perceived it. A man came sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that everyone might believe through John's testimony. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. The true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was created by him, but the world did not recognize him. He came to what was his own, but his own people didn't receive him. But to all who did receive him, those who believe in his name, he has given the right to become the children of God. Children born not by human parents or human desire or by a husband's decision, but by God. And now the Word became flesh and took up residence among us. We saw his glory, the glory of the one and the only, full of grace and truth, who came from the Father. Now this is an amazing text, very different from the other three. And it's written to a different audience. That's why it is so different. The other Gospels, you'll notice something about them. They'll say things, but especially Matthew's, it was fulfilled, the word that said X. It was fulfilled, the word that said X. Whatever Jesus did, this was to fulfill the word that said. You don't see that in John, and there's a reason for that. By the time we think, I disagree with this, but this is the common scholarship on John's Gospel. Most scholars think John was written between 80 and 95 AD. I think that's wrong. I think it was written prior to 70. I think all the Gospels were written prior to 70 because none of them mention the destruction of the temple. You would think these good Jewish boys would notice the temple being torn down. So they don't mention it, and I'm going to say that's because they were all written prior to 70 when the temple was torn down by Antiochus Epiphanes. By Titus. So Matthew gives us this, and Luke does as well, a detailed genealogy of Jesus' lineage. John doesn't even mention it. This is John's Advent text. You don't see anything about the birth. You don't see anything about Mary. You don't see anything about the shepherds. You don't see anything about the star. You don't see anything about any of that. Why is that? It's because it's written to a Gentile audience. By the time John, let's say John wrote in 70, even by 70 AD, there was a large Gentile contingency in the church, a large one, because Paul had already, his missionary journeys were in the 40s. So the church has spread over the Mediterranean region into the Greek areas, and this gospel is written to appeal to the Greek mind completely. Think about it. If you were, people in this era of history could not, most people could not read at all. Now, that may not seem significant to us. We're so used to reading. We're so used to literary understanding. At that time in history, what would be the point? You didn't need to read to keep sheep. You didn't need to read to grow vegetables. You didn't need to read to do most anything, a tanner. You just didn't need it. And so people didn't bother to become readers. There was no reason for it. All you needed was somebody, a few people who could read. They were statespeople. In the case of the Jews, they would be the rabbis and the teachers and the priests. They could read. The Greek, if you were to give them the lineage and you said son of David to a Greek, they'd say, who's David? We don't know a David. Maybe they had a friend named David, but they don't know anything about David as a Jewish king. So it's a very important person in Jewish lineage, but for the Greek it has no meaning. They don't have any sense of connection to it. The term Messiah. What's a Messiah? For a Greek, they have no idea. They understand Christos, but they don't understand Messiah. So what's happened here is that, and I believe this fully, based upon the comparison between the three Gospels and John, is that God has given John a supernatural insight into the Gospel that he gave to no one else. And it's specifically to bring a universalization of the Gospel to all people. Wherein all people could. Why do you think it is in modern church life Ask anybody who's involved in pastoral work or evangelism, what will they tell a person who's either not a believer or a brand new convert? They'll tell them, go read John. Why? Because it is the gospel written to the Gentile audience. So, God has given John a revelation here that is completely miraculous and geared to a specific audience. And he brought it to a people who had no connection to the temple rites, to the sacrifices, to the priesthood, none of that. They don't know anything about that. Imagine Paul going to Ephesus or Paul going to Galatia and talking to these people. He's not going to talk to them about the temple or the sacrifices. Why would he do that? They don't know anything about it. It wouldn't make any sense to them. So what? It would just be another religious structure on the face of the earth that they don't have any connection to. He's got to talk to them in a language that makes sense to the Gentile mind. Therefore he says, ein arche hein, hologos, kai hologos, hein proston, theon kai theos, hein hologos. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and God was the Word. Oh man! It gives me chills just to think about what John has done here. He has reached beyond all of the cultural trappings of Judaism into an audience that doesn't have any connection to any of that at all. And then he does this most amazing, this is why I know it's supernatural. He takes, Logos would have been completely understood to the Greek mind. No problem understanding it. The Greeks understood the world to have an order that was behind it, which they called the Logos. Think for a minute what John is doing here. The Jew understood light. And look at our text. The Logos was the light of humanity. They saw the light, but they didn't recognize the light. I mean, John has taken the Jewish context of light, which for the Jew meant God is present, the Shekinah glory of God in the temple. And he brings in the Greek picture of Logos and sticks them together and says, you want to know what God has done? Jesus is what God has done. The Logos has become flesh. That's who Jesus is. The Greek would say, I can see it. I can see it. And you see, I mean, think about it like this. You know, Jesus meets the woman at the well, right? And he's thirsty. So he asks her for something to drink. And she says, well, I'm a Samaritan. You're a Jew. Why are you asking me for something to drink? Jews and Samaritans don't even talk to each other. And they get into a conversation, and she talks about, we're told that we're going to worship God on this mountain, which was the mountain in Samaria. And Jesus says, there's a day coming where you'll worship God neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, but you'll worship God in spirit and truth. And he tells her straight out, God is a spirit. You don't need to tell a Jew that. They know that already. They're totally familiar with God as a spirit. You don't need to explain that to them. But in John's gospel, he explains it to the Samaritan woman. Very powerful. Now, the connection to grace here with John is specific to John's personality. John, I don't know if you remember this in Luke, they're having this conversation. They're always having conversations about who's going to be the best, who's going to be the greatest, who's going to be in charge, what seat will I have, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus calls John and his brother James Boanerges, the sons of thunder. Why does he call them that? Well, all you got to do is look at the text. Do you want us to call fire down? These people who didn't pay any attention to us? Who's going to be the greatest? Is it going to be me? Is it going to be my brother James? And then, when they couldn't cast the demon out of the little boy, when they come down from the Mount of Transfiguration, James, John, and Peter, and Jesus, they get to the bottom of the mountain, and John says, we got some guy over there, Jesus. You need to go see to him. He's casting demons out in your name. He's not one of us. John was very intolerant. He was a son of thunder. Do you think maybe grace means something to him? I remember reading about Jonathan Edwards. You may not know who that is. He's probably the greatest philosopher preacher this country has ever had. 19th century, part of the Great Awakening here in this country. He had a daughter. Jonathan Edwards, one of the titles to one of his sermons is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Now, if you got a title for a sermon like that today, who's going to want to come hear that? Well, anyway, so Jonathan Edwards was a pretty fiery guy himself, but his daughter was made him look like Mr. Rogers. And there was a guy who was courting his daughter. And he came to Jonathan Edwards, as one would do, and asked for her hand in marriage. And Jonathan Edwards just looked at him. They'd been courting for a while. Jonathan Edwards says, no. Now imagine if you go to ask for somebody's daughter's hand in marriage and the guy just says, no. Now what do? And he says, well, I love her, Jonathan Edwards said. And the guy said, she's a Christian. Jonathan Edwards said, she is indeed, but you can't have her in marriage. And the guy says, why? He says, because only God's grace could live with a temper like hers. You can't. So that's the miracle of grace, isn't it? Isn't it? That God takes you and me, just like we are, with all the failings, all the ridiculous ways that we behave, all the things we continue to think wrong, do wrong, say wrong, and yet He accepts us right where we are. He doesn't ask us to change. He might change us over time, that's for sure, but He doesn't ask us to change. All He asks us to do is come to Him and ask for the mercy He offers, which He extends to us just because He wants to do that, by grace. Think about it like this. We use language in the church, we say, accept Jesus as your Savior. I don't like that language at all, because that's not what's happening. What's happening is, I'm coming to Him and asking for mercy, and then He's going to accept me. That's what's going on, and He does. There was a woman, think of this for a moment. This may not make any sense to anybody, but it makes sense to me. We've got 20,000 pages in the legal code in Washington. Did you know that? Who can keep track of all? I bet you I'm breaking laws right now that I don't even know about. I'm doing something illegal probably right this very minute. 20,000 pages. Have you ever looked in a lawyer's office and you see that bookcase behind them with just books and books and books and books and books and books? You know what those books are? They're records of legal precedent, where a case decided this and a case decided that. And they have to go back and study through and figure out how that applies to what they're doing in their legal work. But a law can't change a heart. We can pass, this is what amazes me about the blindness of our culture at present. We pass laws and laws and laws and laws and heap them on top of each other as though that's going to change people's hearts. You're not going to get rid of racism by passing laws. Never going to happen. But God can change a heart, and it's the grace that God offers that changes the heart. I remember reading about this woman. She had written into what used to be called the Christian Century magazine. You've probably never heard of it. It's long been out of circulation. But she wrote in about her husband. She'd been married for 40 years, and then her husband died. And she'd gotten remarried. She'd been remarried for about 3, and she'd had an event in her marriage that she just felt like she had to write about. So it went this way. She wrote about her husband. Her husband was a tyrant. 40 years of just living with an ogre. Totally demanding, never appreciative of anything she ever tried to do. Food had to be a certain way. The house had to be cleaned a certain way. The bed had to be made a certain way. The bath towels had to be hung up in a certain way. Everything had to be a certain way, or she was in trouble. And she lived like that for 40 years. And then he died. And then she married another man. And this man was just the most giving, gracious, wonderful, kind person you could ever imagine. Well, one day she's in the bedroom and she's cleaning out some drawers. And she pulls a drawer out and there's a piece of paper underneath the clothing. She picks it up and it's a to-do list that the other husband had given for her to do. Here's the to-do list. You better do these things or I'm not going to be happy. And she looked at the list and she realized now she was doing everything on that list just because she wanted to. Because the kind grace that her husband now was giving to her inspired her to do it. She wanted to do it. That's what God does. There is so much power in God's grace in them changing what we want to do. I mean, I was a person with a very sharp temper. Very sharp temper. I am not now. Why? God has changed who I am. Just because he wanted to do that for me. Just like he's wanted to do those things for you. When Jackson was little, this struck me from the very beginning. I noticed that Jackson didn't care. When he was a baby, he didn't care what I was thinking about at all. He didn't care. If he was playing on the floor, I walk in, I could be brokenhearted, had a terrible day. Jackson didn't care. He just kept playing. Or he just wanted my attention. And of course, I might be sick, feel terrible. And Jackson just wanted my attention, so I would give it, right? You do that. He couldn't return. He couldn't appreciate anything that I was going through at all. He was not able. I remember thinking when he was little, I thought, if I died today, he wouldn't remember me at all. Becky would just have to show him pictures and say, here's your dad. And yet, we love the baby, right? The baby can't really return any of that. The baby can't appreciate it. The baby can't give us a card saying, boy, you've been a good dad or a good mom. Can't do any of that. That's the same as it is with God. We kind of blunder through our life, unconscious most of the time, about how much God cares for us and what that grace that he's offered to us has really done in us. We're so used to it now. So much of our lives are just moved through without that awareness of what God is doing and has done in our life through his grace. That's what the Advent is. The Advent is a reminder, a celebration, if you will, of the fact of this being who looks at us in our blundering blindness and yet loves us and receives us anyway, just out of his wanting to do that. That's what grace really is. God just wants to do that for us. The Advent is the story of this God who loves us that much. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me,